Should you buy the planer first or the jointer first? The answer is almost always the planer. You should buy the planer first. The planer can joint and plane. The jointer can only joint. It cannot plane. That's all you have to really know. If that's your question, the answer is the planer. Now I'm going to go into a short bit of argument as for why, but just remember, the jointer can only joint, the planer can plane and joint. I've had this planer for 2, 3, maybe even more years. I love it. I've done everything with it, and including with the table saw, I've had no issues other than time consumption, getting things flat and square and all of that. I recently got the jointer. I haven't used it enough yet to really give a review, so this is not about a review of these tools, though I do love this, but I got this to save a ton of time. It takes a bunch of time to joint things on a planer, but it can be done, and many people do it, and I did it for years. There's a reason that you will see this far more commonly than the jointer in most small, especially shops. The planer can do, and the table saw combined can do what the jointer does. It's just more time consuming. You also can edge joint using a planer. It's just a little bit more complicated and even more time consuming. But if you have a table saw, you can easily do it on there. Just for a brief explanation, the planer makes two sides parallel to each other, so you have an even thickness throughout, and it removes wood on a face to change thicknesses. All the jointer does is make one face flat and one edge flat. That's all it can do. It cannot make the other face equal in thickness to that face, cannot make the other edge parallel either. It can only do one face and one edge, and therefore if you do not have a planer, you're going to likely have a board with a nice flat face, but the other side is not going to match it, and it may be 1/2 an inch down here and 5/8 of an inch up here, and it's essentially useless. This alone is not going to help you a ton. So I'm going to head over now to the whiteboard to just give you a little diagram so you can definitely picture what these two things do, because in a weird way, they are very similar machines in terms of the concept of how they work, with one key difference that changes the use of this and the planer. In order to better understand why the planer should be bought first, let's look at the jointer and then the planer, and then we will look at a planer sled and how that works. Now the first thing to notice here is that on a jointer, the cutter head is on the bottom and the wood rides over it. The second thing, and the most crucial, is that these two tables are independent. This one generally stays fixed exactly on line with the cutter head tip, and this one can go up and down. This is our infeed and our outfeed. And what this allows us to do, in theory, if everything is set up correctly, is remove a cut exactly equal to the distance between these two tables. So imagine we've got this piece of wood here, and I can't really draw a 3D piece of wood, but imagine there's some kind of like cup, something on the bottom, a twist. It's not equal. It's not nice and flat across like this top is, though the top will usually be awkward too in some way. And we will feed this through such that a cut is taken along this line. This is a little bit low, and it will remove these two low points. And therefore, after a couple passes, we will eventually reach up to this level such that we have now got a straight line across the board. I know that's a little messy looking, but by the end on the outcome, after a few passes, we will get a piece and it is nice and flat on the bottom, but the top may not be even. This may now be something like this, and that's why we cannot just flip this over and do this again, because it will then make this side nice and flat, but this side will not be equal. For the sake of this diagram, we're ignoring the fence. We then would run the face up against the fence, and it would do the same thing to the bottom edge, creating a 90-degree straight flat edge to the face. But we're just looking at the face for this because the planer mainly is used for face surfacing. So hopefully this gives you the kind of look at why this will leave one face flat, but will do nothing for our other face. We're going to look at the planer now. The premise of the planer is that we feed wood a certain thickness on this side. It is removed an exactly equal amount to the cutter head, how low that is set to the top of the wood, and it comes out an even thickness on the other side. Very simple. Now let's notice the major difference here. This table is consistent and parallel in everything along it. There is no split. There is no independent raising and lowering. So whatever is on the bottom here is not going to change relative as we go through. It's only going to be the top having material removed. And because this is all the same throughout, everything is referenced off of this bottom piece. Now, if your bottom is nice and flat from a jointer or from a planer sled, that's great. It's going to run through flat. It's going to remove it. It's going to be flat on the top and flat on the bottom once you've created enough remove to create an even thickness. Awesome. It works really well. In order to show you why the planer on its own will not flatten the face, let's look at some kind of extreme example here. Now the planer works that instead of hand power holding the piece down, there are these two big rollers that push the wood down onto the table as it goes through. But you'll notice these are separate. They're not together until the wood is touching both of them. So when this banana piece of wood goes through, this one is going to shove this side up here front down flat on this table, and this side's going to go way up in the air. It's no longer going to be flat. So it will remove a nice amount, even thickness from this front, and it's going to go through. But then all of a sudden, as we pass through, that front is going to come up until we hit this other roller. And now this will be down, and it will remove a kind of swoop out from it. Instead of taking a nice flat cut, it will just remove material along this swoop, and it will remove an even amount so that it's still thickness across it the same amount, but it will do nothing to create it flat because it is just shoving it down. It takes a cut, and then it's going to swoop up, and then it will get shoved down again, and then as it exits, it will swoop up, and it will take that amount, but we are not getting a flat board. Now this is obviously a very extreme example, but we're left with big banana to a small banana. It's still a banana piece of wood by the time we get out on the other end. Fortunately, we can solve this problem with a planer sled and shims. We take our banana again, but this time we're going to choose some kind of composite material, often MDF, and we're going to use that to create our own reference face. We're going to then use shims so that this piece of wood cannot rock as it goes through the two rollers that are here to press it down. It will now just be pressing it down on this flat surface, and the planer will go through and it will remove these tips as it goes through, and you'll be left with a piece that is flat on the top, which has now created us a jointed face, and we can suddenly flip it over, and now we've got what would normally be a jointed board. The only problem with this is it's simply time consuming, and you have to store a sled, and it gets really time consuming if you've got a bunch of pieces to do. It works. It absolutely works. In general, you can get a flat face using a planer sled on a planer, and this is why buying the planer first makes sense. You cannot do this with a jointer that then you just flip this board over, run it through, and you've got a parallel flat face on the other side. Only a planer and a planer sled can do this all in one tool. The other thing that's really helpful if you have a planer, there are ways to joint an edge with a planer. It's just more time consuming and requires some more complicated jigs. The easiest way though to get that edge that the jointer will also give you is with a ripping jig for the table saw. This long part here is the fence. This smaller red area is a jig that rides up against the fence, again made out of some composite that's nice and straight and flat. Table saw blade is here. We are looking down at it. Now this is your piece of wood. It's got this huge bow in it. Now fortunately though, we can ride up against the fence with this flat area and just cut a straight line right through there. Now you obviously lose material, but of course you do with the jointer as well. Now you've suddenly got one straight face on the board so that you can then just flip it over, run that against the table saw fence, and you've now got two parallel edges. So it's ideal with a planer to have a table saw as well to deal with the edge. It can be done with a planer, but most likely if you were buying a planer, you have a table saw. Now, one criticism I do see of going the planer first or planer only method is some limitations perhaps in the length of a board that you can face joint, because it gets really unwieldy to deal with a gigantic planer sled. And that's true, that's fine, I totally accept that. You are limited to maybe, I don't know, 4 feet, something like that before it gets a little awkward, and your shop may not even be big enough for that in the first place. But I would retort back that the size of the jointer also inherently limits you. You just can't take any jointer or benchtop jointer and run an 8-foot long piece through there. It's just not going to work. It doesn't have the reference surface for that. And also remember that without a planer, the jointer really serves no purpose to you because you can't get it parallel anyways. So if someone's saying, you got to have a jointer and you only have enough money for one, and they're saying it's because of size, that doesn't really matter. You still need the planer. So go with the planer first and work around that. Try to work around your projects, or you can be a person who builds a really big planer sled. It's just a bit unwieldy and a bit awkward, but it will still work. I just don't find that there are many good arguments for buying a jointer first if you're not going to get a planer at the same time. Hopefully my little explainer here has led you to the same conclusion I have, that buying a planer first is significantly more important. You can get a jointer later, or you can never get a jointer. What you can do on a planer, you simply cannot do on a jointer, and what you do on a jointer, you can do on a planer, and ideally with a table saw to help you as well, but that's not absolutely necessary. There are other jigs to joint boards of a certain width on the planer as well. It's just not as easy. The jointer for me is about time. It's about efficiency. It's just significantly faster than using a planer sled and a jointing jig at the table saw. That's it. I could not think of any scenario in which the jointer should be bought before the planer. If you have one though, put it below and leave a little bit of reasoning, and maybe you've got a convincing argument. I just think the planer far more important and should absolutely be bought first. All right, thanks for joining me. Have a good one.